Well, if you are new to Treeline, welcome. So glad you guys are here. My name is David. I'm the lead pastor of Treeline Church, and I get to open up the Bible and teach it fairly often, not every week. If you keep coming, there'll be some other people up here, but I get up here every once in a while, and I'm so excited because we're continuing this series called Marks of Discipleship. And if you got a handout on the front, it said something kind of crazy when you walked in. It said radical generosity in a world of selfishness. And so that's the title of this message, but it's also like a one of the marks for Treeline, and we kind of introduced this series basically saying, hey, our big vision statement here is really simple. Man, we're a church all kind of focused around cultivating authentic followers of Jesus. We want to help people follow Jesus in an authentic way, and that's basically simply what we want to do. And so we kind of were asking this question, well, man, if we're doing a good job with this, like if we're actually helping people follow Jesus, and this really becomes like a culture of people who aren't just kind of saying, hey, I attend church, or hey, I'm a little bit spiritual, but are really saying, man, I love Christ. He's changed my life, and I'm actually trying to follow him. We're basically asking the question, like, what would that look like? What would mark a community if it was filled with people like that? And so we came up with 9 marks that we're basically praying God would begin to mark our church with. That as we become like known in this community, because we're a new church, we're only a year and a half old, but as we become kind of known in the community of, hey, there's this group called Treeline, they follow Jesus, like they actually believe this thing, they open up the Bible, they read it, and then we would say, man, we hope these are the things that they go, and we don't know a lot about them, but these are the things that we've noticed about them. You know, 3 weeks ago is joy. They're these people of like just defiant joy, like no matter what is happening in their lives, like you just can't get these people to stop being thankful for the life they've been given. We want to be people that have this kind of unshakable peace that like when the world goes through things, we just cause them to just like complain about their situation. These Christians, like they just really believe that like God is in control of their life and that he's on the throne and everything that's happening in their life is somehow going to be used by God for their good. They believe that. So they have this like crazy peace. And so this week, this is our 3rd mark, and it's radical generosity. I want to start by telling a story. It's a famous story in the Bible. You're probably familiar with it. There's this moment in Mark where Jesus is in the temple and he's teaching. He's been kind of an itinerant preacher. He's been all over kind of Israel, but he finally lands in Jerusalem. He's in the temple, and the temple is an amazing place. Like it is an architectural marvel. If people would travel from literally all over the known world to come and visit this place, because this is the place that supposedly the God of Israel dwelled once bodily. And so it's this incredible kind of place, and Jesus is there. He's teaching, and there's also these amazing kind of feats of religiosity happening everywhere around him. Like people are walking around in these like flowing robes with like prayer beads. And there's these like extremely elite religious people who are kind of performing their religion in all kinds of ways. And so there's a lot of things happening that Jesus could point to and be like, wow, isn't this impressive? Isn't this amazing? And what Jesus does is kind of stunning. He stops his teaching, and he basically grabs most of the crowd, and specifically his close followers, his disciples, and he goes, you have to come and see something that's about to happen. And so he gets them, and he comes over to this little area of the temple where people would bring in offerings. And basically that's saying like all the Jewish people were meant to kind of bring some generosity from what God had given them back to the temple. And so he's like, I want you to come and stand here and watch what's about to happen. And there's a bunch of people who come in, and if you've read the Bible, you know that the way people would sometimes give, these like religious elites, they'd literally have someone like blow a horn in front of them and then be like, watch me, and like dump a huge amount of cash in, and everyone would be like, wow, like look at this incredibly spiritual person. And so that's happening. And Jesus is like, no, ignore all that. And then there's this woman who comes in. And we don't know a lot about her, but we find out in the story that she's a very poor woman. She's probably not dressed in any kind of elite religious way like everybody else, but she walks in and she just very simply takes 2 coins that are kind of like the lowest currency, and she drops them in and then walks away. And then Jesus is like, that was amazing. Like, did you see this? And everybody's like, I don't think we saw the same thing, right? And Jesus is like, this is incredible what just happened. And he begins to explain simply, and he's like, look, there's a lot of people doing all this lavish stuff here. That's fine, but they're giving out of their prosperity. This woman gave out of her poverty. And actually, you need to know, she didn't just give something. She literally gave the last 2 coins she had. And Jesus is like, he's not pointing at this as like, this is what every single person should do. He's just saying there is something happening in the heart of this woman that so changed her experience of life that she would look at her life and go, literally, this is the last amount of money that I have. And instead of viewing her life as one of scarcity where she has to protect even this little thing that she owns, she goes, you know what? I can just freely give this to the kingdom of God in hopes that it might be used to bless someone else, trusting that God's going to provide for me. And Jesus goes, I'm telling you, that's the most amazing thing that's happened here today. Generosity. And it's not just generosity, but it's this radical generosity. Like somebody who doesn't just give out of the excess or kind of saying, man, I've had this crazy windfall year. Like it's very easy for me to give an extra few $1,000s to the church or to this organization and to this nonprofit. But the kind of person that's like, I'm actually going to give in a way that directly affects the life I can live, this kind of radical kind of generosity. Jesus looks at that and goes, that is amazing. One of the other famous stories in the Bible, you may have heard this, it's the man Zacchaeus. Anyone heard of Zacchaeus? We don't know a lot about him, but we know he was a chief tax collector, and we know he was very rich. And we find out from this story, this interaction Zacchaeus has with Jesus, that a lot of his wealth didn't just come from this position he has as chief tax collector, but a lot of it came from extorting people he was supposed to collect taxes from. And so he'd say, hey, you owe, $40 when really they owed 30, and he'd keep the last 10 for himself, right? And this is a normal practice of the day, which is why everybody hated tax collectors, okay? But the way that he had lived, the choices he had made, they had basically set him on a path that was really far from every kind of spiritual sphere. Right? He didn't frequent the temple. He wasn't like a regular person in like religious communities. Actually, they couldn't stand him because they were like, you are extorting us. Like you're not generous at all. You're greedy. You take from us. And that was the position that he was in. That was who he was. But he hears about this teacher, Jesus. And he doesn't know a lot about Jesus, but he just knows Jesus is different. There's something about this man that is compelling to him, unlike every other religious teacher of the day. And so when he hears that Jesus is going to come through his hometown, Zacchaeus goes, I have to see him. Like even if just from a distance, I have to get close to this man Jesus to figure out what he's all about. And so Jesus comes into town. He's trying to get close to Jesus. And it says that he is a man of small stature. And Andrew can tell you about that, not because he's small, because he taught on this, okay? He did like a deep study of what that meant, okay? That's not what I mean. He did a deep study of what this means. But basically most people say, hey, this probably means that he couldn't see over the crowd. And so he climbs a tree, right? And this is, if you've been in Bible school, you've learned the song. Zacchaeus was a wee little man, and a wee little man was he. He climbed up in the sycamore tree to see what he could see, right? Okay. So Zacchaeus, he climbs up in this tree to see Jesus. And that's a wild thing for anyone to do, let alone like a man of elite status. He's like climbing a tree. He's like, I got to see Jesus. And Jesus, in the middle of the crowd, he looks at Zacchaeus. He calls him out by name. And he says, Zacchaeus, it's big. Once again, he's like directing the whole crowd to look at this man. And he says, today I'm gonna have dinner at your house. And that's a weird thing, because today you're like, you just invite yourself over for dinner, bro. Like what? Like how weird would that be in a normal situation? You're like, hey, I'm gonna eat dinner at your house. You'd be like, really? What? Like, I don't know you. Like, seems kind of assuming, but in this culture, basically, that was an invitation into profound relationship with Jesus. And it was basically Jesus in the moment saying, hey, look, everybody here can't stand you, but I want you to know you are welcomed into my presence. I want you to know that I view you as someone who is worthy of honor and dignity of my presence. And I want to come and spend my night with you at your house. I want to bring my friends there. Like it's this really kind of profound moment. And what's interesting is this welcoming in of this person who kind of everybody knew was just a sinful, greedy, rich person. Jesus looked at him and said, I accept you exactly as you are right now. The very next thing that happens in the story, and we're not sure if this happens at the house, at the party, or if it happens literally in the middle of the crowd, but this is what Zacchaeus says. He just responds to this welcoming of Jesus this way. He says, behold, Lord, the half of my goods I give to the poor, and if I have defrauded anyone of anything, I will restore it fourfold. So this man's response to this welcoming in of Jesus is just to immediately have an entire different posture towards life. Like the very first thing he does is just take half of what I own because I recognize I'm wealthy and I'm just going to give it to the poor. And anyone I've ever wronged, I'm going to repay them back fourfold. Like anyone ever stole anything, you want to repay that back fourfold, right? Like that's a lot. And he just immediately becomes not this greedy person who's focused in on himself, but all of a sudden he looks up at Jesus and he becomes this person marked by radical generosity. And what Jesus says when he sees this change is he says, I tell you, today, salvation has come to this house. And it's interesting because Jesus isn't saying, oh my gosh, Zacchaeus did this amazing act of generosity, therefore I grant him salvation. He's saying, no, like he actually got it. Like I welcomed him into my presence, and that so changed his life that the response of that was generosity. And so Jesus is saying this moment of generosity is like evidence that this guy's actually saved. He gets it. He's had this profound change in his heart, and now it's overflowing in his life. And so Jesus is saying, look how amazing this is. And so this text today in 2 Corinthians is basically this moment with the Apostle Paul. And he doesn't want to point out a specific person, but he wants to talk to us about a church that had such a climactic encounter with the grace of Jesus that they became this radically generous church. And not just generous in their own city or to their own people, but they actually became the church that's going to end up partnering with Paul through their generosity to extend the mission of God and the gospel to all the corners of the Roman Empire. And I want you to hear from Paul this story. So this is 2 Corinthians. This is Paul. He's writing a letter to the church in Corinth. So he's writing a letter to a different group of believers, but he wants to tell them the story of this grace of God that's happening in this other church in Macedonia. And so let's read here in verse 1, 2 Corinthians, and we're just going to kind of pop in there. Here's what he says. I want you to know, brothers, about the grace of God that's been given among the churches of Macedonia. And so he's saying, I want to tell you about grace, like this climactic, amazing situation of grace that God's given to this church, and I have to tell you this story. And so he's going to tell them about the grace. Here's what he says. For in a severe test of affliction, their abundance of joy and their extreme poverty have overflowed in a wealth of generosity on their part. For they gave according to their means, and as I can testify, beyond their means, of their own accord. Now listen to what it says next. Begging earnestly for the favor of taking part in the relief of the saints. And he says, and this wasn't what we expected, right? There's this situation happening, okay, where Paul is on this missionary journey. And, one of the things that ends up happening is Paul takes the gospel to this place in Macedonia, the city of Philippi. And there's this profound thing that happens where people hear the message of Jesus, their lives are changed, and then Paul has to kind of quickly leave the city because there's this persecution. And then this church basically has this posture where they go, this is unbelievable. Like this story you've shared with us, that we're no longer in bondage to sin, but through Jesus Christ and his grace, we can receive forgiveness for sins. We can be restored to our God. This has changed everything about our life. And if there's any possible way we can be part of helping you take this message to the next place, we want in. And so this church becomes this radically generous church. But they're going through a very hard time, okay? The church in Macedonia, it says they're going through a severe test of affliction. They have severe poverty. And so Paul basically self-selects for them and says, hey, I'm going on this other journey, but look, you're going through, you got people in prison. I mean, you guys have no money at all. Like you're just going through it. You just need to get through this situation. This is not for you. This is for other churches to be generous in this moment. And this church, in these churches in Macedonia, they say, oh, heck no. Are you kidding me, Paul? And they basically go, if you're going to take the message of Jesus to more places and more people are going to come to know Jesus, we want in. We want in. And so they gather together and they go, can you believe this? Paul thinks we don't have anything to contribute to this. Let's show him he's wrong. Let's show him that actually you should expect generosity from us, because we've received the message of Jesus Christ. Jesus was generous to us, therefore we're going to be generous to whatever comes our way. And so this is what they do. They basically gather these churches together and they just take an offering. And the offering is significant. And it's so significant that Paul goes, this makes no sense. He literally says, you didn't give according to your means, you gave beyond your means. Meaning like, I know your situation, you shouldn't do this, right? Like, this is not a wise thing for you to do because of the situation of life you're in. And they say, watch us. Watch us. We want in. And so Paul says, you have to know about the grace of God that's been given to this church. And he calls it grace. It's so interesting because, you'd think if Paul was going to tell us about the grace of God, you'd think he'd say something like, man, the grace that's been given to this church, you'd think he'd say something like, dude, they had this huge windfall of a year, and dude, someone realized they invested in Bitcoin, they found their password, there's just this crazy overflow of money, and so they're able to be so generous to this situation. It's not what he says. Actually, they had extreme poverty. Extreme. And the grace isn't this unique outpouring of spiritual gifts or healings either. It wasn't some miraculous removal of suffering from their life. Actually, they're still in prison despite probably a lot of prayers to be released from it. And the grace, it isn't that in the midst of all these things, there was this crazy, lack of chaos. It was yeah, we're in prison. Yeah, we have no money, but things are steady, right? It's no, it just says there's a severe test of affliction. It's this crazy moment for these people. But something had happened to them that changed the way they viewed the world. And that allowed them not to view their situation as one of scarcity, but as one of abundance. And there was something in them that created such an overabundance of joy that even in the midst of their circumstances, they were the church that led all others in generosity. And this church, not because of what God had given them financially, not because of what God had given them situationally, but because of what God had given them through grace and joy in the gospel, this church ends up being the most generous church to Paul in all of his missionary journeys. They will become known as that. Somehow God's given them less finances and they give more. Not as a percentage, literally more. So these really wealthy churches that are really well-to-do, Paul's I get almost nothing from them, and the bulk of my ministry expenses are actually provided for by this little church in Philippi. And so he goes, this is absolutely incredible. And actually, this little church is responsible for the spread of the gospel through much of the known world. It's incredible. It's just incredible what happens through these churches in Macedonia. And so here's a question. What happened to these people that allowed them to kind of become these radically generous people? Because this generosity wasn't just towards Paul and ministry. That people in that city also said, we don't know what's going on in this church, but they just keep blessing our community. We don't know what's going on, but there's this whatever they have, they just share it. They make their neighborhoods better places. They make their places of work better because they're in it and they're so incredibly generous. What happened to these people? And here's a question, could it happen to us? Well, I think what happened was that there was a change in the story that they were living in. I want to talk about Story for a minute. Our third daughter is named Story. That is not why I want to talk to you about Story. I love this idea that there are certain narratives that you live in, and the narrative you tell yourself about your life, you often live that out, right? This is why psychologists tell you if you want to believe something, speak it over yourself, right? Which is really kind of silly, but also weirdly kind of works, right? It's if you stand in the mirror and say, I am successful, you have a better chance of being successful. It's just what you think the story you're in actually does affect the way you live in your life. But what's very interesting is the Bible says there's something way more powerful than just self-talk. There's God talk. God has actually done something in the world where when you come into an encounter with him, he doesn't just change your perspective on your life. He literally changes your life. He actually gives you a new story. And this is what happened in these churches in Macedonia. They now had a new story. But before we understand what their story got changed to, we have to understand the story that we're currently in. And the Bible starts with a story. And it starts with a story of how the world was designed. It starts with a world about actually how the world was originally designed, but also how it changed. And you might be familiar with parts of this story, but if you're not, basically the story of the Bible begins with God. It just says God is the main character. He's the main author. Everything is about him. And the thing you need to know about God is that he was a creator. He created everything. And he creates and he designs humanity as like the center crowning jewel of his creation. And God ends up doing something profound. He creates a garden. Like he literally gets down into the soil and he works this place. Like there's this kind of hands-on intentionality working the soil. He plants all kinds of trees. And the picture they're given is this garden of abundance that God just designs, that's overflowing with goodness and life, provision. And God takes Adam and Eve and he places them in this garden and basically says, dude, this is for you, all of it. Like you can eat from every tree you want. It's all for you. And so he takes this abundance and he shares it with humanity. And so the story that we start with in the Bible is this, is that God is creator, but he's also provider. So humanity wasn't told, hey, you have to kind of like scratch and claw at this earth and bring something out of it so that you might have something to live on and eat and survive. God says, no, I've done literally all that for you. Just enjoy. You're hungry? Boop. Eat it, right? Whatever you want. And you're like, I don't like fruit. I do not think it was just fruit trees, okay? I'm like one of those weirdos, like, I think it was bacon trees. I don't know. Like, I just think there was like, it was this kind of unbelievable situation where it was like, I don't have to provide for myself because I'm in this situation where there is this being who's greater than me and more powerful than me who's already provided for me. But there was one rule. There was one boundary line that they were told not to cross, and there was this one tree that basically represented like a decision before them. And they could either continue to live under the provision of God as Father, or they could basically step out from underneath that relationship. And in fact, the lie that they were told was that they could actually become like gods themselves. And this was the decision that humanity made. They believed the lies of another, they ate from that tree, and their story changed. And because of that, our story changed. And the primary way that our story changed was that we were cut off from God. We became cut off from our provider. This is the last scene in Genesis 3, and it sort of sets up like the situation we find ourselves in today as people who know we should be generous, and yet we feel in our hearts this radical selfishness that's like hard for us to get past and actually be these benevolent people in the world. The last scene in Genesis 3 is humanity being ushered out of the presence of God, out of the garden of abundance, into a wilderness of our own making. And here's what's very interesting. Everybody who wakes up in 2024 knows with clarity this world is broken, right? No one walks in here and goes, I disagree, right? It's like, no, like we all know that. Like sometimes to the depth of our being, like it might even be the reason you walked into church today is you just look at your life and the world around you and the systems and the government and the culture and the people and everything that exists and you go, this is broken. Like it's not supposed to be this way. I mean, some people have lots and some people have so little, it's staggering. There's this imbalance, injustice. People get wealthy, not often just because they work hard, but sometimes it involves oppression. And here's what's interesting. Every single system that humans have ever come up with is in some way trying to solve this problem. How do we take this wilderness and turn it into a garden once again? How can we do that? And so we've come up with a bunch of different ways, right? For a long time, we had the feudal system, basically a bunch of poor people gathering together under one family, one kind of monarch, and to serve them and make them prosper. And they're sort of kind of all lifted up by this, a little higher status. At least they're protected. But at the end of the day, you're still peasants, right? It's like we decided a while ago, like, we don't like this. Like, yeah, it's better than just being out there in tribes, but kind of worse, right? And so we realized we don't like this. It certainly works better if you're the king at the top. And we kind of came up with capitalism. This isn't obviously, this is not a history class, by the way. Some of you were like, you radically misunderstand the feudal system, okay? So capitalism, all right? It's like, here's a question. How is that working out for us, right? How is it working out? I mean, we have riots in the streets, like whole groups of people feel incredibly disenfranchised. There's this wealth gap between the rich and the poor that is increasing at staggering rates. And even if you're in the room and you're like, I think this is the best system ever, at the very least you should go, and yet there's this profound inequality in it. I mean, the bottom 50% of America owns 2.6% of the wealth. That's a hard statistic. And so at the very least, we should be able to look at that and say, this is not really a picture of human beings thriving. And then you have socialism. One of the great mysteries about our current social climate is that we're still hopeful enough to believe that this just hasn't been tried well enough, right? We go, that's really this, it just hasn't been tried well enough. And if we can just get the right guy in office and get rid of all these things, we can just finally create this utopia. But my goodness, millions and millions of human lives were taken in pursuit of that utopia. I mean, like some of the absolute carnage of really the last 100 years was in people trying to figure out how do we enforce this in the world. And it turns out the only way for everyone to have the same is for everyone to have nothing. And here's I just want to be clear. I'm not trying to make a political statement right now. I know that some of you in the room, you believe that the answer of selfishness, inequality, suffering, and even poverty, the answer to that in the world is if you could just get your hands on the levers of power, you would know how to fix things. I know there's some of you in the room that believe that, and you go, I know there's just a system that would fix this if we could just enact that. But what is fascinating to me is for almost everyone in the world, we intuitively believe it would be easier to change the entire overarching system of our world than it would be to just change what's going on inside our hearts. It's like we have these options: change the entire system of world governance, or to individually become a truly generous person. And most of us go, I'll take the first option. It seems easier, right? It seems easier to wage wars and create these systems because at the end of the day, we look inside of ourselves, and those who are truly honest, truly observant of what's going on, you go, I don't know how to fix the depth of selfishness that I see in me. That seems impossible, but maybe we can fix the entire system over all things. That's silly, but it makes sense. When you look inside yourself, there is something broken in you that no matter what you do, you cannot figure out how to fix. That is my experience in my life. When I look out at the world, and I look out at our marriage, our church, our community, it seems so easier for me to figure out how we could fix everything else than just to fix some of these really things that are really deeply broken inside of me. Because if you're like me, you've tried. You read verses like this and you're like, generosity, and you're like, yeah, right? Like, I know. I want to be generous. I don't want to be somebody that even though I have given to the people that do the ground cover letter, like there's still something in me that if I see them at a distance, like I might try to take the other side of the road, right? Like, I don't want to be that kind of person that like struggles with generosity because still somewhere deep down inside of me, I don't want to give. I don't want to be generous because I really believe that I need this stuff for me. I mean, maybe I'm the only person in the room that struggles with that, but I don't think so. I think as you sit here in the room, there might be an area of your life that you go, I'm generous here, but there's that one thing. Maybe it's your time. Maybe it's like this corner of my life. You go, this is mine. Don't touch this. You know, it's very interesting. I think it's easier to try to fix the whole systems of the world. I think it's why we get so up in arms about elections, because we just think, man, if we could just get the right person in office, then this thing would be fixed. But it's very interesting. You know, the people who cry out about the injustices that happen at the border, they're the ones who find themselves unable to deal with refugees when they land at their doorstep. This is true. But similarly, the people who decry the evils of abortion, they find themselves unable to open up their homes for adoption, nor to really take care of the mothers of those babies, nor to even have their taxes raised so the state can provide for some assistance to them. And once again, I'm not trying to make a political point. I'm just saying it's easier to try to figure out how to fix the systems or the culture or the world. And I've found the reason we do this is because deep down in our own hearts, we figure out these are the most difficult things to change. And what's interesting is if you ask experts and you say, how do we change the world? Their answer is at the most local level possible, right? Start there. But when you go to the most local level possible, which is your heart, it turns out the most local level of our heart causes us to come face to face with how broken the world really is. Because no matter what system we find ourselves in, there's no system that can change your heart. And I'm guessing if you're in the room, you're like, dude, I've tried. I've tried to change my heart, and I cannot figure out how to do it. One of the largest shifts that took place in my life 11 years ago was I got married. And if you wonder if you're selfish, man, just do this. Get married to somebody who's only the slightest bit different than you. It's amazing. I mean, it's just an amazing thing. It turns out, no matter how many things you thought you were doing correctly, you were not, okay? There's many things you thought you were killing. It turns out you are not. You don't realize how much of your life is really just focused around you when you're young and single. And so just for college students in the room, you have to know that. You're living in this crazy privileged moment where you can deceive yourself into thinking your life's not about you. It is. And maybe by God's grace, he'll bring things into your life that will help you realize how truly selfish you are in these moments. And I'm not coming down on condemnation. I'm just saying this is the reality of the situation. Anyone who's in here who got married is like, yeah, my life immediately got more transparent to me about how much my life was focused on me, right? And then something else amazing happened. We had kids, okay? You thought you were selfish before. Oh my goodness, you have no idea. I mean, children force you either to stop caring so much about yourself, your wants, your time, your hobbies, your mental health, and just become a generous person, or you will just become a miserable person. It's two options. Figure out how to be generous, or be miserable, or run away from the relationship and the kids. We have this whole generation of people who are actually running away from marriage and away from childbearing, and that's happening through divorce and kind of, we know that in divorce, but it's also just happening in people choosing not to get married. I think there's this kind of cultural phenomenon right now where young people are looking at marriage, which is pick one person for forever. They're like, I don't know about that, right? And then also what you should do with them is have kids. And tie yourself down to these kids and pour out your life in raising them and giving them everything you can so that they can move forward in life, which basically means you're not going to do the things you currently dream about doing. There's not that many families who on Instagram ride around the Grand Canyon in a van with a bunch of kids. There's 3. They got a monopoly on that, somehow they make enough money to do it. You didn't get on the game early enough, you're probably not them. Most everybody else lives in a house and works a job, comes home, makes meals, changes diapers, raises kids, and then kind of looks in the back view mirror and goes, wait a minute, I thought we were supposed to do all of these amazing vacations and amazing plans and live this aesthetic life experience, and all of a sudden I'm a dad. I came to this conclusion a few years ago. I was like, oh my gosh, I'm a dad now. And that was never the dream I had for my life. I wanted a motorcycle, and now Stevie's like, you can't have one, you're a dad. And I was like, what? Dads can ride motorcycles? She's like, not this dad. All right. It's this crazy situation, right? And I've heard that a lot lately, actually, this plea people have is sometimes people say, hey, I don't want to do that hard thing. I'm trying to prioritize my mental health. And I just want to kind of get on a soapbox for a second. That's fair enough. I get that. We live in a very therapeutic society. We live in a society that says, man, if you get into a really stressful situation that causes you anxiety, you need to get out of that situation. Here's what's fascinating. If that's your goal, you should be absolutely sure to never get married, never have kids, never adopt, never foster, never move into an impoverished neighborhood that's more dangerous to try to bring light into a place of darkness. I actually can't think of a valiant, courageous, generous way to live your life that wouldn't in some way conflict with your mental health. And if that's what you prioritize, is me, my space, my mental health, my comfort, even my anxiety, man, it will keep you off the front lines of almost every good and beautiful thing that's happening in the world. You see, what a lot of us are trying to do is we're trying to figure out how to change our wilderness back into a garden. And it turns out this is a very hard thing to do. And you just kind of get to the bottom and you try to change yourself, and it turns out to be the hardest thing of all. Because here's what happens when you lose God as the provider of your life. You lose God as the one person who, without fail, is always looking after you and caring for you. When you lose that relationship, you're forced to step into that role. And this is what happened when we got kicked out of the garden. All of a sudden, all of humanity looks around and goes, who's going to care for me? Who's going to look after me? And the answer is a resounding silence. And so we basically go out in the world and we try to figure out how to do that ourselves. I mean, it's like a really hard and difficult thing. And you go, okay, I have to become my own provider financially. Like, I have to become my own provider in terms of finding a life for myself, finding a job, finding interest. I have to step into this role of caring for myself. And here's what's interesting. Any opportunity of generosity, even when you want to do it, it feels like it comes in conflict with this goal and role you have of caring for yourself. And that's kind of true. Because even if you're like a pretty wealthy person, every amount of resources, anytime you take your money and use it to take care of someone else, you necessarily have less to take care of yourself. And so there's this conflict that happens in our lives where we want to do good to others, but we know we're the ones who are in charge of doing good for ourselves, and we have this tension in a world of scarcity, this wilderness that we've created, where it feels like we're kind of on our own. Selfishness is now the default mode of the human heart. I mean, it's a deeper story than that. Like, sin has infected us, it changes all this, but like the baseline situation, we live in a world of scarcity. Things feel like we don't have enough, and selfishness is now the default mode of the human heart. And I'll just be honest with you, it's the default mode of my heart. And so here's something amazing that the gospel does that no philosophy or system of government or city council can do. It actually welcomes us back into a relationship with God. Like, this is something that happens when you meet Jesus. It reconnects us with God, not just as our creator, but as our provider, because it turns him into our Father. This is how this section ends in 2 Corinthians. I want you to see it. He's pointing at this church and he's saying, look at this grace, look how amazing this generosity is. Then the next thing he does, and he says, and I want you to be generous. I want you to get to experience the joy of living a life like this. And he ends by reminding them of the story that now marks their life. This is 2 Corinthians 8:9. We actually talk about this verse all the time at Treeline. It's probably familiar for you. For you know the grace of our Lord Jesus Christ, that though he was rich, yet for your sake he became poor, so that you by his poverty might become rich. There's this question for people who lost their provider, who are trying to figure out how do we get God back into the right role in our lives. The answer the Bible gives us is there is actually nothing you can do. You cannot be generous enough. You cannot give so much to the church or to people who are impoverished that God says, okay, there you go. Now you've done enough. I will once again come back into your life. There's one thing that would work, and this is what it is. Jesus Christ, the true Son of God, would actually come off his throne in heaven, would come down as a human being into our wilderness, and he would actually trade places with you and me. He's like, hey, you look like you're kind of poor, you're impoverished, things are scarce around here. How about this? How about I take that situation? I take that part of the story, and I give you mine. And what Paul is saying is, this is basically what happens is as though Jesus Christ has this exchange. He goes, I want your poverty so I can just empty the storehouses of heaven on your life so that you can actually once again have God not just as creator, but he can be your Father who will provide for everything you need in your life. So if we ask the question, how did these Christians in Philippi become these people? Well, the answer is God actually got back into the rightful place in their life. all of a sudden God was their provider again. And so they weren't looking around the world and saying, we have to provide for ourselves. They were like, oh my gosh, the one who sits on the throne is looking out for me. He cares for me. He's providing for my life. I don't need to do that. Now I can just be a steward. So if God is my provider, it means I am a steward. And here's what's interesting. All of our lives are God's. That means our time, our talents, our treasures, like everything. God calls us to be generous with those things. But when Jesus talks about generosity, more than anything else, he talks about money. And Christians, along with everybody else, don't like talking about money. And that's why Jesus talked about it so often. It's because he's like, hey, there's this, like, one of the greatest litmus tests you have of what really has, like, the throne of your heart is just, where does your money go? I mean, we talk about this. We say, like, man, if you want to know what somebody really worships, just look at their checkbook. It will show you. Philippians, you go, what did they worship? The answer of all their city, all the other churches, they love Jesus and everything he's about. One of the questions about our lives is, what are we about? What do our checkbooks say we worship? Statistics on giving are very interesting. At the bottom of the socioeconomic ladder, people give around 4%. That's about how much they give from, and that's like basically $40,000 a year all the way down to the very bottom. They give about 4%. When you get into the middle range, 50 to 100K, basically that section that's like, I feel kind of good about myself here. Maybe not in Ann Arbor, but everywhere else. I feel pretty good about myself. You get into the middle, 50 to 100K, people give around 2%. So it's very interesting. You make more money, you give less. And then you get into like the extremely rich, like people who are making like millions of dollars, and it actually bumps up to the staggering amount of 6%. Okay. That's a joke, by the way. That's not a staggering amount. These are the averages. And religious people, on average, give actually a lot more. And so then you turn inward and you say, well, what's going on in the church? Well, the numbers are very interesting here as well. Churches cost a lot to run. I don't know if you knew this, but like this doesn't just exist. Like, people bought this. We set it up. Like, we have a trailer. We have expenses. It costs to rent this room. Like, there's just things that cost money to run a church. And what's really interesting is that 50% of people who attend church as regulars. So this is not like if you're here and you're like, I'm just checking out Christianity, like this is not about you at all. But 50% of people who regularly attend church, and you'd be like, yeah, this is my church, they give nothing. So 50% give nothing. 50% of the crowd essentially pays their share and the share of others. It's almost like a potluck each week that a bunch of people show up to, and half of the people don't bring any food, but they eat. It's a weird thing, but that is the church. And that's almost every single church in America. And what's interesting is Treeline is a new church, and actually our numbers are better than that. Like, there's more than half of you who give, which is like super encouraging. But not that much better. It's about 50%. And it's interesting that of that 50, so 50% of the church gives nothing, 50% is kind of generous towards the church. And of that 50, there's like an 80-20 rule, okay? So that means 50% who give, 80% of the people who give, they give 20% of the whole. Does that make sense? 80%, 20. And then 20% give 80. So here, if you look at all of it, you crunch the numbers, there's basically 10% of people in a church who fund almost everything that happens in a church. So like all the ministry, all the missions, all the social justice initiatives, mercy ministry, benevolence, care ministry, like there's this tiny group of people in almost every church that they are filled with such an overflowing joy to get to be able to be part of this and to bring the kingdom of God to bear in their city and amongst their people. And they're the ones who basically do everything. And then it's true. Everyone else basically just rides along on their coattails. And here's the thing. If you're in that 50% who come regularly and don't give, you have to know, I'm glad you're here. Like, genuinely, I'm glad. There's some pastors who look at their budget and they're like, what is going on, right? I don't feel that way. And man, if you're a non-Christian in the room, you have to hear me say this. There's a reason if you walk in, you'll never see us pass an offering tray at Treeline. Like, intentional decision. We've just said, man, like the last thing we ever want is for someone to come in and feel like they're presented with this choice. Like, do I help support this ministry or not? It's like, there's almost no choice at all. Like, we actually had such a cheap, horrible offering box that it fell apart. We now have a new one and almost no one knows where it is, all right? Somewhere in the room. You can find it if you really want to give. But we try to actually almost hide it because we don't want to present people this idea that, man, Jesus wants your money. Because Jesus is like, I don't. I want your heart. I don't need your money. I'm the king of the universe. Like, you think I need your cash? Like, please. And there's a bunch of college students in here. You have a debt. Okay. So the other reason. No, but really, if you're non-Christian, I just want you to know that. There are people who are in this room and actually across America who helped us start this church who are saying, I want to give up like the lease on my new car. I want to remortgage my house. I want to like make significant sacrifices in order to support this ministry so that you can come and sit here for absolute free for as long as you want and hear the message of Jesus so that it might change your life as it's changed ours. And I just want you to know, I am never going to have a conversation with you as long as you sit here where I go, please, 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 would you help support this ministry? I'm only going to say, please, 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 would you come to know Jesus Christ as your Savior? He's amazing. He's changed my life. He can change yours. So that's if you're a non-Christian and you're here. I'm so glad you're here. But for those who are believers, who are regulars, and you don't give, or at least you don't give in any sort of regular way, that you're not kind of included in that normal group of people, you just have to understand, no one here is mad at you either. I mean, our vision statement is to cultivate authentic followers of Jesus, which means we hope our church is filled with a lot of immature believers who over time and the preaching of the word and discipleship can come to maturity in Christ. And one of the other reasons people are not mad at you, who always show up at the potluck with no food, right, is because we were once one of you. Like, this was my story in college. I came to know Jesus in college, and I had my life got turned upside down. Like, I wasn't trying to be a pastor. This is like a new idea for me, okay? Like, I had great plans that involved chemical engineering and money. Different plan happened for me. And when I was in college, he just changed my life. But all through college, those years, I actually gave almost nothing to the church I was part of. And I was part of an amazing church. Like, I was part of Salt Company. I loved my time there, but I gave almost nothing. And I look back on my time and I'm like, well, what was going on there? Was it because I was poor? Like, I just didn't really have any money? No, that wasn't the reason. And the reason I know is because I actually had money to buy the things I wanted. I mean, some of it was pretty expensive. Like, I remember buying like a really nice new camera for my photography business I was starting. And I was like, oh, I had money. I just didn't have a vision for my life to leverage what God had given me to expand beyond myself yet. And it took a while for this part of my life to be changed by Jesus. What was true is I was just immature. I was young. And honestly, I was just still kind of selfish. And so if you're a Christian and you don't give anything to the church you attend, maybe you're a guest here, and by the way, don't give money to Treeline, you're a guest here, but like your church back home, like you should give money to the church you're part of back home, because it's one of the primary ways God's called you to be part of building his kingdom. You should do that, but also the reason you should do that is because if you don't, it's actually going to keep you from the joy that Jesus wants for you. It's going to keep you from the joy Jesus wants for you. And here's the thing, we're going to get super practical. I know this is going a little bit long, but I want to get practical for a second. Everybody wants to know a number. Like everybody I talk to, they're like, I'm a Christian and I know Jesus says to be generous. So how much? Like, is there a percentage? Is there an amount? Like, I just want to make sure I'm giving to God exactly what he requires of me. And here's what's amazing. You can search the entire New Testament. You will not find a number. There's no percentage. You just have this story of God emptying the storehouses of heaven on your behalf, taking your place on the cross so that he could make you spiritually rich, become your provider and everything. And now he just says, now you go and live like that amongst other people. Be generous in the way I've been generous to you. And here's what's true. People who live those kind of radically generous lives, those are people that actually change the world. They're people who change cities, they're places, they're people who change cultures. A few super quick principles and then we'll end. Things that I think I've noticed about radically generous people. First thing, they actually give more than they can spare. This is C.S. Lewis. He's kind of answering the question, looking in the New Testament, figuring out what's the rule, how much should we give? He says this, I'm afraid the only safe rule is to give more than we can spare. He's like, I don't know. I don't know any other way to kind of, how do we know we're giving enough? He just goes, until you're kind of giving more than you kind of should. C.S. Lewis says that's about the right amount. That's how much radically generous people give. They don't give what they can. They give a little more than they feel like they can. They also give in a way that meaningfully changes their life. Here's a vision I have for Treeline Church. My vision is this. People of our city would think we're way more poor than we are. People in your neighborhood would go, that person must have a crap job because they have a very old car that they have, like, why don't they get a new car? Like, you live in this neighborhood, why do you drive this old car? I hope the story is they come to you and go, man, like, what's the situation? And they find out how much you make eventually, and then they go, what is going on? And you go, Jesus is what's going on. I hope we live the kind of lives where we actually live below the kind of status we could have if we're not generous people. Radically generous people also give as a rhythm of their life, not as a response to a moment. You know, one of the other reasons we don't kind of pass a tray is because we don't want our generosity to just be this like momentary thing where you go, oh yes, I should do this. We want to cultivate a kind of joy in our people that they go, this is the rhythm of my life. I'm a generous person, whether I'm at church, whether it's in my neighborhood, whether I'm walking down Ann Arbor, this is the culture of my life. The last thing, radically generous people give to direct their heart. Jesus says that where your treasure is, there your heart will be also. Some of you in the room, you're like, dude, I don't feel this. Jesus says that you should actually give because as you give, it like pulls your heart towards those things. And so some of you, the reason that Jesus is something you're like, I've just never felt this affection. It's like, have you ever just given to him and his ways? It might be one of the things that starts to pull your heart along with you. Here's another thing. Radically generous people create margin in their life so that they can be led by the Spirit. Have you ever noticed if you are so busy in your life, sometimes God will say, hey, stop, slow down, talk to this person. But you live such a crammed full life with no margin that you feel like you can't. I think a lot of us are that way with finances, where you spend everything you get, you're so leveraged out that if God would say, hey, could you give to this person? Realistically, you can't because you've left no margin in your life. Radically generous people always create margin. And the last thing is this, radically generous people open up their life to God's provision. I'm out of time, but I want to share a story. It's such a good story. There are people in our church, you just have to know this. There are people in our church that live such amazing lives of radical generosity that they get to experience miraculous provision in their lives. Like there are so many stories of people in their church who have given beyond their means and put themselves in a situation where they knew without question, if God's not real and God doesn't provide for me, I'm kind of going to be in a bad place. And do you know what has happened when people have stepped out in faith and chose to be generous to this church or to other people or to other situations? God has been their provider. Like their provider. Like here's a story you don't hear in Ann Arbor. There's a group of people, I'm not gonna tell you who it is, but there's someone in this church who was like, I love the mission of this church. I wanna be part of it so bad, but I can't. I look at it and between my bills and then my rent, like literally there's nothing left. And this isn't the kind of person who's like, there's nothing left because I buy a new shirt on Amazon every week. This is like literally, there's nothing left other than the essentials, yet they prayed and they felt called to give money to Treeline. And they met with me and they were like, what should we do? And I was like, dude, I honestly don't know. Probably not. Like, I don't know. You probably shouldn't. You're in a really precarious situation in life. I don't think I would counsel you to give. You should just pray, and whatever God tells you to do, listen to him. But I don't know what to do. They prayed. They felt like God was leading them to give, and so they just did. And you know what happened? Their landlord said, hey, we're going to lower your rent. Ever heard of that in Ann Arbor? Anyone get any letters from your landlord that's like, hey, we decided to cut your rent in half? No. But you know who does? People whose God is their provider. Because God supplies the need. Treeline, I love you. Let me pray.